We're going to read out of Genesis chapter 39 and starting in verse 6. Let's see, Genesis chapter 39. And he left, this is speaking of Joseph, and he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a godly person and well favored. And it came to pass, after these things, that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph. And she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is in mine hand, what is with me in the house. And he hath committed all that he had into my hands. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkeneth not unto her, to lie by her, or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by the garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. You may be seated. We're going to speak today about how to handle temptation. Now, this story of Joseph gives us a remarkable illustration and a wonderful example of how to handle temptation, especially the temptation towards opposite sex. There is a remarkable example as Joseph is tempted. He responds in a godly fashion, and we can learn so much from it today on how to handle temptation. And that's the title of my message today, How to Handle Temptation. I want you to notice in the story we just read of Joseph, how likely it was for Joseph to fall to temptation. How very likely Joseph was to fall to temptation. First of all, he was a youth. He was a young man. He may have been around 18 years of age at this time. And so he's a young person, and you know that young people are particularly prone to this kind of a failure, a moral failure, and with the opposite sex. He also had just come into some unexpected prosperity. He had recently been sold as a slave, captured by his brothers, put in a pit, sold to the Midianites, and he ends up in Egypt as a slave. Now recently he's been promoted, and apparently he's been so prosperous that his masters made him head of the whole house. So he's a young man, and he's gotten unexpected prosperity. He's approached by a superior, the wife of the master. And you know that when someone who's in your superior position approaches you, you tend to do what they tell you because of their position. It happens with us as we feel like, well, we have to do what they say because they're a doctor, or they're a lawyer, or they're a government official, and they try to get us to do something that's sinful. And so the temptation is greater when there's a superior power. And it wasn't a subtle temptation, it was overt. She came right out with it. She came right out and laid all her desires right out before him. She didn't tempt him through subtle means. She came right out with it. And then, of course, it wasn't just once, but it was day by day. Day after day, the temptation kept coming. So this wasn't a momentary temptation. It wasn't the first time he had this kind of temptation thrust in his face. It was over and over and over, day by day, it said in the scripture. But notice also Joseph's godly response. Joseph's response, he absolutely refused without hesitation. Notice that he instantly refused without any hesitation. He even avoided her company. Says he wouldn't go in the house where she was. He replies to her when she speaks that he's going to injure the master and the master's interests, and he's also going to injure God. So he instantly responds. He also fled. He fled as though his life was in danger. He fled instantly upon her having been captured by her. He took off running, and he fled as though there were assassins in the house trying to take his life. He was not slow to get out of there. And this is going to be a great example for us. A great example for us on how to avoid sin, and as far as possible, whatever would lead to sin. It's going to be an example for us to be careful of things that lead to sin. So we're going to talk today first about the importance of avoiding whatever leads to sin. And second, we're going to warn everybody, especially the young people, about this kind of sin. So let's talk first about the importance of avoiding whatever would lead to sin. Now here in Joshua's example, Joseph's example, he would not keep company with her. He wouldn't go into the house. It wasn't a sin for him to be in the house. It wasn't a sin for a man who's in charge of a house to go into the house. But yet, in this example, it says that Joseph would not even go into the house. And why is that? Because he was trying to avoid that which would lead to the temptation. And that's a wonderful example for us. It wasn't no sin, but it was a desire for him to keep himself from being tempted. He instantly fled. He would rather lose his coat than his integrity. He was a man who took off instantly and fled. He was a man who was responding. And this example for us is a wonderful example as we look at Joseph's life. Some people are called upon to be in situations that lend itself to temptation, whether in their station or their job, and they have to expose themselves to temptation, and they know it's going to happen. And they have to do it. It's their duty to do it. But if they are walking with God, God will give them strength. So there are situations that maybe in your job, your coworker would cause you some sort of temptation, and you know it, but you still have to go to work. Maybe your job situation would cause you to be exposed to temptation. Maybe you have a relationship that's causing you difficulty, and you know you have to go to a family dinner where somebody's going to cause you trouble. But we can be sure that even in all of these situations, that it is right to trust in the Lord and He'll give us strength. It says in the book of Matthew, if you want to turn over there to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, verse 23. Matthew chapter 10, Jesus told them this in verse 23. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 23, it says, "But when they persecuted you in this city, flee ye into another." He told them when there was trouble in one city to take off and flee to another. But it is true that some people cannot flee temptation because of their situation. So for those people, they are safest when they're doing their duty. They're safest when they're doing their duty and trusting God. And therefore they can expect, like Proverbs 10:9 tells us, "He that walketh uprightly walketh surely." If their hearts are right, and they're walking with God, and they have to go into a situation with temptation, they can be protected. Jesus knew he was going to have severe trial at the cross. So what did he do? He prayed the night before, and he prepared himself for the trial. And the Lord was strengthened by the angels even that night to pray. So we can be sure that if we walk uprightly, we will walk surely. There are those people who have to be in a situation that is that they're tempted, and they can't help it. But let's now move on to think about the reality that there is no cause for us to put ourselves in the way of temptation willingly and expose ourselves to temptation without a cause. There's no reason for us to set ourselves in a place where we know we'll be tempted, excluding those times when it's our duty to be in those places, which some of us have to be in those places. It is a reality that there's no cause for us to expose ourselves willingly. Remember, Joseph did not want to even go into the house because he'd be exposed to the temptation. There's no cause for us to do this. How can we know that there's no cause for us to do this, and how can we explain it and explore it so that we can see it? Well, we're to do all we can to avoid evil. Everything that we can, we should do to avoid evil. The more something is evil, the more evil it is, the more we should do to avoid it. I mean, that makes perfect sense. Turn, if you will, over to Joshua chapter 22. the more evil something is, the more duty we have to avoid it. Sin, of course, being a great evil, an evil against God, and an evil against the infinite holiness of God, is a great evil, and therefore we should take all kinds of pains to avoid it. Let's look in chapter 22 of Joshua and verse 5. But take diligent heed to do the commandment and the law which Moses the servant of the Lord charged you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cleave unto him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. We are commanded to take great caution to do the will of God. We're commanded to use diligence to heed the commandments and to take care that we do it just the way God tells us to do it. Therefore, when we see that there is something that would lend to temptation, and we know that there's evil behind it, we ought to do all we can to avoid it. We ought to do all we can to hide ourselves, shelter ourselves, and like Joseph, hide and run from whatever temptation. To use no caution and run into temptation is a great act of foolishness. To use no caution is to demonstrate that we don't think sin is that big of a deal. So we need to be sure that we recognize the foolishness and the needlessness of running headlong into temptation. But we're supposed to hate sin, right? We're supposed to hate sin, not expose ourselves to it. We're supposed to be people who are Christians who, like God, hate sin. He says that he hates sin, and we are supposed to also. We're supposed to dread it. Dread it like we would dread death or the devil. We're supposed to hate sin in every form and fashion that we find it. You may have seen a child that's been frightened by a particular kind of animal. Sometimes a dog will do this. When the child is small, they'll be frightened by a dog. And then for the rest of their early days, they don't want to be near that kind of animal ever again. They don't want to be in a room with it. They don't want to go to a house with it. They're afraid of it every time they see it. And the reason is because they've once been frightened by it. And we need to take that attitude with sin. We need to be like that around sin. We need to be afraid of it. We need to be frightened by it. We need to want to not be anywhere near it. You're not getting me in that room. I know I'll sin. I don't want to be in there. Sin contains a certain amount of judgment of God in it. It contains a certain amount of damnation in it, of condemnation in it, and we don't want to have any of that. We don't want to be near anything that is so wicked, so destructive, and so ugly as sin. How can we get so close to something if we hate it? So we're looking at the reality that we can't get close to sin. We have to be like Joseph. Joseph ran from temptation, and we need to do the same thing. But it's also evident that we can't get anywhere near sin because we also act this way with other things. We already act this way with other things. When it comes to our temporal interests, this is already how we act. We avoid the things that hurt us. Right? We already know that when it comes to things of this world, we avoid the things that hurt us or that lead to our hurt. We don't just avoid the things that hurt us outright, but we avoid the things that might lead to our hurt as well. And we should do the same with sin. We don't just want to avoid the sin itself, but we want to avoid the things that lead to the sin, just like we do in every other area of our lives. If let's just say, for instance, you were to go up across a bridge. I know my wife doesn't like wooden bridges, the drawbridges, the kind that swing. I think they're called rope bridges. She doesn't like those kind of bridges. And when we ever get on one, the first thing I do is shake it a little bit, make sure that it rocks, and she squeals at me. But the thing is, if you looked at that bridge and it didn't look very safe, why, you wouldn't get on that bridge. You wouldn't take the first step on the bridge because you know that if it broke, you would fall. Now, that's not actually falling, but if you look at the bridge and you think it might not be safe, what are you going to do? You're going to avoid the bridge. Because then you're going to be protecting your life because there's potential for harm in something, and you don't want to deal with that. You don't want to face the harm that would come from potentially looking at it and potentially falling through the bridge. We do this with our property to keep it from being destroyed. Your financial situation. Now, when you decide that you're going to expand financially, and you go to strike a deal with a business partner, do you concern yourself with whether or not that business partner is a shady character or an honest character? I mean, don't you think that although he hasn't actually stolen my money, he might steal my money? If he looks a little shady and you think that there might not be a full level of trust that you can place into him, what do you say? I'm not going into business with that guy. I don't trust him. He might harm me. He might do something to me. We would look at that and we'd say, well, I'm not going to expose myself to potential harm with my finances. Why, I would lose. And shouldn't we then do the same thing with sin? Shouldn't we do the same thing with sin where we say, well, it's not actually sin, but this certainly has it in it, that element that's going to lead to temptation, and I don't want to expose myself to that kind of harm. I want to be careful that I don't go here because I know this is going to lead to temptation. Same thing you do if you're sick. When you're sick and it's raining, and somebody says, can you go out there and take care of something outside? You say, oh, I've got a terrible cold. I don't want to go out in the rain. Why, I could get pneumonia. Or if you're not, if you have a newborn baby and you don't want to take that baby out because you know somebody might have the germs and the sickness, and you make them wash their hands first because the baby's immune system is low. Or you don't want somebody to, the worst thing is if you sneeze and then ask if you can hold somebody's baby. I don't know if you've ever seen that. Somebody coughs and sneezes and hacks and then says, can I hold your baby? And what does a new mother say? No way. Back away from my baby. I don't want you holding my baby. Even they say that to their own mother because they don't want the baby getting sick. And we do that for our health. Why not do that with sin? Why not do the same thing if it would potentially cause some harm? I want to stay away from it. We got to be that careful. Careful to avoid anything that would lead to sin, anything that would give us any kind of harm. And if we don't do that with our finances, what do we say? Well, this person's not taking care of their money. And if we don't do that with our health, what do we say? Well, that person's not taking care of their health. And if we don't do that with God, what do we say? Well, this person's not taking care of their spirit. They're not taking a watch over their souls. They're not taking care. We should avoid sin and anything that would lead us to it. We also do this with our friends. We do the very same thing for our friends. When it comes to our friends, we watch out for them. We concern ourselves with not only what would actually cause them loss, but what would potentially cause them loss. Loss of reputation, loss of personal property. We concern ourselves with what would cause them to be harmed in any way. And if we would do that for our friends, and you would do that for your friends, wouldn't you? If you saw somebody that you thought maybe this person is going to take advantage of your friend, or maybe this person's going to do harm in some way, or maybe this is going to cause their reputation to be injured, you are going to take care of your friend. You're going to say something to them. Even though nothing that bad has actually happened, you are going to warn them. And you're going to say, hey, you need to be careful with this person. I don't think they're going to do right by you. They're your friends, and you ought to do that for your friends. And ought not you to also do that for God? Ought you not to concern yourself with His glory? Ought you not to concern yourself with what is going to interest Him and what would harm Him and what would be injurious to Him? That would be it would be very obvious if you would do that for your friends but not do it for God, that God's not your friend. Why not guard God and His interests like you would your friends? In fact, if your friend didn't do that for you, and they allowed something to come in they knew was potentially harmful, you would have somewhat of a right to be upset with them. You'd have somewhat of a right to say, well, if you saw this coming and you didn't tell me, how come you let me fall into this pit? How come you let me fall into this trap? And they would say, well, nothing actually happened. I mean, it might or might not have happened. And you could have said, well, why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you say something? I thought you were my friend. Why didn't you say something? And we would have that same objection with our friends. Why not have that same attitude about sin? We don't have to wait till we actually sin to say something's harmful. We know that there are certain things that cause us to be tempted and lead us to sin. Why not act the way we would with our friends? That's the way a true friend acts. Why not act the same way? And not only do we act that way with our friends, but we also act this way when we want God to act this way towards us. We want God to act this way towards our lives. God does a certain thing for us, and we say, well, God, please, I see this coming, and I sure want you to order these things and so that I don't get hurt in this. Oh, God, I want you to order such things so that I don't lose my money, that I don't lose my family, that I don't lose my reputation. Oh, God, I want you to order things in such a way so that no harm comes to my life. God, you go to sleep at night, don't you pray that God would protect your home? And God would protect your interests? And you put your little children to bed, and don't you pray that God would protect your babies? And He'd raise them up tomorrow morning so that you could kiss them on the head? Because you want God to order things in such a way for your good. Well, if you want God to do that for you, isn't it right and expected that God would want you to do this for Him? Wouldn't it be fair for God if we want Him to do the same thing for us, to guard us from anything that might lead to our pain, our hurt? Wouldn't it be right for us to do the same thing for God? And to say, God, please keep me from doing anything that would tend to your hurt. Keep me from seeing anything that would tend towards my temptation and hurting you. Keep me from anything that would lend itself to tempting me so that I'm not in the way of temptation. Let's not go headlong into temptation. Not just avoiding sin, but avoiding the things that lead to sin, just like Joseph's example. Jesus taught us to pray like this. He said, when you pray, say, Our Father which art in heaven. And then He went on to say, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. He told us that we're to pray that we would be delivered from evil and not led into temptation. Now, what does that mean? When Jesus tells us to pray that we're not led into temptation, that means we're to confess that temptation itself is bad. It's a bad thing for us to go there on purpose. Temptation in and of itself is not a sin, but temptation in and of itself leads to sin. And therefore, to put yourself in the way of temptation is to do the very opposite of what we pray to God. Lead us not into temptation. Why would you pray for God not to lead you into temptation when you run headlong into it? That would be the opposite of what we're supposed to pray. We are, if you'll turn over to the book of Romans chapter 14, we are directed to avoid things that lead others to sin. Look over in Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14, we are to avoid the things that lead others to sin. Now in Romans chapter 14, we read this in verse 13. Let us not therefore judge one another anymore. Let us not judge one anymore, but judge this rather, that no man put a stumbling block or an occasion to fall in his brother's way. Now, if you look over in verse 21, it said, It is good neither to eat flesh, nor to drink wine, nor do anything whereby thy brother stumble, or is offended, or is made weak. So, not only did Jesus tell us to avoid temptation, but then we find that we're also directed to not do anything that would lead to someone else's temptation. Now, we can ask the question is if we're not to do things that are, if we're to avoid things that are lawful, and these lawful things are for us to avoid to keep from harming someone else, how much more is it wrong for us to go into temptation and to willingly go into temptation knowing that other people will follow? if we're to avoid things that are lawful and good for us, if it's going to cause someone to stumble and we're to be careful for them, how much worse is it for us to run into temptation knowing that this is going to lead itself to sin? And what if other people follow? It's going to be someone following you right into the same temptation, and what if they can't handle the temptation? What if they fall? We have to be careful. We know we're not to run into temptation. We're not to lead other people into temptation. But we're also commanded by Christ to avoid those things which lead to sin. Turn over to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. Jesus has commanded us what to do with things that lead us to sin. In Matthew chapter 26, we read this. That's not chapter 26. There we go. Matthew chapter 26. It says this in verse 41. Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. We are to watch and pray so that we don't enter into temptation. Jesus has told us and commanded us to be careful about where we find ourselves, because we need to be watching and praying so we don't enter in to any temptation. We're told to abstain from every appearance of evil. We are to be very careful where we find ourselves, so that if we are tempted, we would know right away that this is something for us to flee from. Jesus says, watch and pray. Be very, very careful about temptation. While you're in Matthew, turn over to chapter 5 of Matthew. Matthew chapter 5. Jesus has commanded us to be very careful about temptation. Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 29. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. He says, if your right hand offend thee, or if the right eye offend thee, cast it off from you, pluck it out, cut it off, and get rid of it. Now, he's speaking figuratively here about the dangers of temptation. And what he's saying is that if you would recognize that you'd be better off to not have a right hand than you would be to let that right hand bring you into temptation, you'd understand the importance of hiding and running from and fleeing from temptation. You ought not to keep anything in your life that you love if it's going to lead you into temptation. And he's saying even if it's a right hand, don't love anything in this world that's going to cause you temptation. Don't love it so much that you would keep it around. Who would want to part with their hand? Who would want to part with one of their eyes? Jesus says, consider how ugly and awful temptation is. It's not even as valuable as your own hand. And so we ought to be careful about running headlong into temptation. Joseph didn't do it, and we ought not to either. But as we consider the dangers of running into temptation, we need to also consider the nature of temptation that Joseph faced. He faced a solicitation to do evil. He faced a solicitation from a woman to lie with her and commit fornication, commit adultery with him. And this is a very dangerous sin. So we're going to next mention how and give you a serious warning to everyone, especially to the youth, about the dangers of this kind of sin. We're going to take the occasion of this passage to give you a warning. We need to give you a warning. A warning about running headlong into temptation. It's a sign of whether or not you fear God. if you're willing to run headlong into temptation, then you don't fear God. Be careful about running headlong into temptation. We need to avoid anything that has a tendency to sin, but especially fornication. This is the passage that speaks about fornication. Joseph fled rather than fall. He fled rather than fall to temptation. Turn with me to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. In Ephesians chapter 5, we read this in verse 3. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not be once named among you, as becometh saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. For this ye know, that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater, hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ, of God, and of God. Here we have a very grave warning that we're to hate everything that leads to any kind of uncleanness, but especially fornication. And today there is a custom that is an accepted custom in our culture, and a custom which is the exact opposite of how Joseph led in his example. And this custom is one that definitely breaks all the rules that we just described about running headlong into temptation. And it is the custom of the young people of opposite sex being alone together, and often reclining together, and cuddling each other, and this is a great temptation for young people. Now look what Joseph did in this illustration. When the woman offered him an opportunity to have any sort of physical contact with her, he fled. And yet the custom of today is for young people to do the exact opposite. They go off alone together, and they put themselves in the way of temptation. And you can't deny that that is a great, great temptation for young people. And then they put themselves in the way of temptation. The tendency to fornication in these situations with the opposite sex cannot be objected to. Nobody in their rational minds can object that there is a great tendency to temptation in that situation. That's the exact opposite of what Joseph did. He would not even go into the house with this woman because she was a source of temptation. He knew himself. He knew the wickedness of his heart. He knew the likelihood of him to fall to a temptation. And he said, no way, I'm not even going to go in the house. And so the custom of today is for the young people to go off and be alone together and put themselves in the exact opposite situation. How can that be anything but a breaking of all that we've already said, that you've all agreed to, that you've all heard from the Scriptures, these rational arguments that these things ought not to happen. We care for our friends, we care for our health, we care for our wealth, we want God to protect us, and then we run headlong right into temptation. As youth, as young people, and the dating scene, they run headlong right into the very opposite of what we're describing today. Nothing is more likely to destroy a young person's purity than to be alone with the opposite sex and find themselves in the practice of doing the very opposite of fighting temptation. It's a very, very dangerous custom. This is the custom of our society. The custom of our society is to find somebody that you like, to go out with them. It doesn't today. People don't even have to be having any sort of a committed relationship with each other. They'll just go out, be alone together, and they will spend all this time exposing themselves to great temptation in the hopes that on the other end of it they come out okay. It's very foolish. Nothing's more calculated to stir up your lust and to place you in danger and positive harm to another person than to be alone with the opposite sex. That is a fact. Once the lusts are stirred up in a person, we all know that once the lusts begin to be stirred up, that further sin is likely. Further sin is a potential. It's very dangerous. Some people can resist temptation for a long period of time and then fall instantly. Some people can resist temptation until they instantly fall. And the truth is that the person who says they can handle it, that they'll be fine, that don't worry about me, oh Dad, don't you worry about me. I'll handle myself fine with this girl. Don't worry about me. Oh Mom, leave me alone. He's a good guy. Trust me. The people who have the most confidence are the most likely to fall. The people with the most confidence in their flesh are the ones who are most likely to fall. It's the ones who say, no way, I'm not going out alone with some guy. I'm not going out alone with some girl. I'm not going to be alone with the opposite sex. Those are the ones that you can have some confidence in, that they don't trust their flesh, that they are not going to expose themselves to danger. If your child was playing on the edge of a cliff, would you feel safe? What if the edge of the cliff was a little rocky? What if the edge of the cliff was a little rocky and sloped? Or a little slippery? Would you feel safe? If you have two children and one is near the edge and one's far away from the edge, which one is safer? The one that won't go near the edge. And yet we would put our children and allow them to go off alone with each other and allow them to be on this edge of destruction where they could lose their purity in a moment. They could lose everything. Unlike Joseph, they would not flee temptation, they would run towards it. This custom is directly opposed to Joseph's godly example. Directly opposed to it. It's the opposite example because it's the opposite of godliness. Godliness runs from temptation, and this dating scene runs people into temptation. It's a very opposite temptation. We can assume that when we assume that we can flourish, we assume that we're going to flourish where wisdom took off running. Joseph, in his wisdom, took off running, and we think that we're going to find the will of God, and it's going to be a matter of peace and wisdom for us, and we're going to flourish in such a place. It's foolish. We're discounting God's plan. We're discounting God's plans for us to watch and pray lest we enter into temptation, and we're discounting it. And we're discounting it in the hopes that in our foolishness and our sinful pleasure will come out okay. It's very dangerous. This custom that we have not only places young people in danger, but it sets a bad example to other brothers and sisters in Christ. Let's say that you can go out on a date with a girl and you'll be okay. But you've set an example, the opposite of Joseph. And Joseph is trying to run from temptation, and you set the exact opposite example. But what about your brother who goes out and goes the same place, and he can't handle it, and you've laid a stumbling block in his way? Rather than being a godly example and say, well, I'm not going to be alone with a girl. Why, I could fall into temptation. And you ought not to be alone with a girl either. And you deliver his soul from temptation. You might be the impetus, you might be the reason why someone falls right into temptation and loses their purity and destroys their potential for God and falls away from their faith in Christ. It is a custom which not only places us in danger, but it places other people in danger too. It places them in danger as they seek to, as they don't set that positive example. Now, people are going to object to what's being said. They're going to object, and they're going to say things like, well, come on, if I listen to what you're saying, how am I ever going to find a mate? How am I ever going to find somebody if I don't go alone with them and date and go out like this? I'll never be able to find a partner if I don't do this. And the question is, what you're really asking is, how can I find the will of God for my life? Because a Christian wants to marry in the will of God. And so we're saying, how do I find the will of God for my life? How can you find the will of God for your life by doing the exact opposite of what he said? He said, watch and pray lest you enter into temptation, and you cast yourself into the situation expecting to find the will of God. How can it be that the custom is right if you have to break the commandment of God in order to get it? And in order to get the will of God, you've got to break the custom. You've got to break the commandment of God. The custom must be wrong. People will object, and they'll say, well, come on, this is how it's done today. This is the way we do it. I mean, this is the 21st century. Come on. people date. That's what they do. And the truth is that just because some people do it, and just because most people do it, since when has it been a Christian obligation to follow the world? Since when has it been a Christian obligation to follow the world and the world's methods and the world's ways in order to find the will of God? Why not do what God told us and hide from temptation, run from temptation, flee temptation, rather than run headlong into it? And then there's this objection, which I think ought to be addressed. And that is, there'll be plenty of people who say, well, we did it and it didn't hurt us that much. You know, we dated, we came out all right. And we didn't have that much trouble. And we're fine. We have a home and we have a marriage, and it worked out all right for us. The truth is, not everybody's going to be destroyed by every temptation. Right? Not everybody falls every time. But somebody could go 100 miles per hour down the highway. And in doing so, they might not hurt anybody. And in doing so, they might not get a ticket. And we could be in the same room and somebody could say, well, I think you should go 100 miles an hour down the speedway, and someone down the freeway, and someone else could say, well, that would be a crime against God. And someone else could object and say, well, I did it and I didn't get hurt by it. Is that a reason to do it? Just because somebody did it and they weren't harmed by it, does that mean it's right? Does that mean that we should all follow that example? We should follow the Word of God. And God says to avoid temptation. This is not avoiding temptation. This custom is likely to harm, and I guarantee you, if you ask most people, did you have any harm come from this? Did you have any harm to your spirit, any harm to your relationship with God, and any harm to your marriage? Then the answer is going to be yes, there was harm. And just because some people are not harmed by a temptation does not mean that it's okay to do it. And so that is no objection. Just because you didn't get harmed by it doesn't mean that there's no harm in it. And just because you don't fall to a temptation doesn't mean that you can recommend it to other people when it's plainly against the will of God and dangerous. Wouldn't we be better served if we were like Joseph? Wouldn't we be better served as a Christian community if we were like Joseph? Joseph decided that he would not put himself in a compromising situation. He would not place himself in a situation that compromises his integrity. He would not place himself in a situation in which he might fall to the temptation that he knew was going to be there. He wouldn't go into the house. He wouldn't put himself in there. The lady said she wanted him to lay with her and recline with her and just hang out with me for a little while. And he said, no way. This is not what I'm going to do. And he then found that she said, lie with me, and grabbed him by the coat. And he took off running. He said, no way, I'm not going to do this. We'd be much better to be like Joseph and not place ourselves in any situation that would compromise our integrity. Joseph fled. We'd be good to flee. We'd be good to look at a custom like this that we see in our culture amongst Christians and say, that's not what God told us to do. He told us to run from temptation. He didn't tell us to run into temptation, and nobody can tell me that a 16, 17, 18-year-old girl and a 16, 17, 18-year-old boy is not at the height of their temptation, and to send them off alone together isn't the worst thing that you can do when it comes to temptation. There's not a greater temptation than to fall into some sexual impurity than amongst young people, and to send them unchaperoned alone together is a very dangerous thing. It's a very dangerous thing, and we are doing this exact opposite of what Joseph has shown us. And God has shown us about Joseph. Joseph held to his integrity, even though the culture was against him. Egypt was not exactly at the height of morality, but he held to his integrity. He held his integrity in a foreign land. He held his integrity in a foreign culture. He held his integrity, and we should teach our young people to do the same. And we should teach them by our own example of running from temptation. We care about our examples to others, don't we? We care about what people see when they look at us. We care about what people find when they look into our lives and they see that, what if we expose ourselves to the kinds of temptations that would cause other people to fall? Well, they're not going to look at us and say, well, that guy's really strong. He can be exposed to that all the time. They're going to think, why would he do this? Why would he set this example? We ought to be an example to other people. We care who we hurt, don't we? We're Christians. We care who we hurt. If you have a young boy and you send him off with a young girl and they go out on to date, do you care if she's hurt? And I don't mean physically speaking necessarily, but I'm talking about, do you care if she's emotionally bruised? Do you care if she loses some of her purity? Why, you're going to send your teenage boy off with a girl. Do you care about that girl? And if you have a daughter, don't you care whether or not her feelings are hurt? And what about the husband in the future, or the wife of the future, the spouse of those children? What about the hurt that they have? And what about the hurt that they're going to face when they go into the marriage and some of the flower has lost its bloom and they have to face the pain with their future husband? We have to care about who we hurt. We'll be responsible for this before God when we let our children hurt each other. We care for God's glory, don't we? Don't we care for God's glory? Don't we care for our testimony? Don't we care what happens to God, how it reflects upon Him when Christians can go to the marriage altar and say, we avoided temptation, we made sure that we did what God told us to do, and we're here in purity. And when the girl wears a dress, she wears a white dress because she's come in her purity. And when the husband receives the hand from the father, he receives the protective care of the father who really did take the time to care and protect his daughter. And this young man really did, and he really can be trusted to protect the daughter because he cares about her purity, he cares about her integrity, he cares about the glory of God. God's glory is at stake. When we run into temptation, we're showing that we don't care about God's glory. We don't care about our testimony before God. We are Christians. We hate everything sinful, right? We hate sin, and we avoid what tends to sin. We avoid what leads to sin. We hate sin so much that we want to avoid the things that lead us into sin. In this example, Joseph has shown us that if there's something in there sinful, then he didn't want to be around it. And that has to be our attitude too. If there's something sinful in it, and there's something about it that's going to tend towards our sin, tends towards our temptation, he just stayed out of the house. He didn't even want to go in because he would have been tempted. And as Christians, we hate sin. And since we hate sin, we evidence that by a desire to stay away from anything that would even tempt us towards sin. Because we love God, we love His glory. Now it may be that you don't hate sin. It may be that you hate the effects of sin. It may be that you hate the consequences of sin. But it may be that you don't hate sin. And you would prefer to run into temptation. You might not like the results of it, but you still throw yourself in the way of temptation on purpose because you are not hating sin. Jesus places the hatred of sin in our hearts when we get saved. And He places that hatred of sin in our hearts because He loves us and He wants us to make us like Him. He hates sin. Now it is true that a Christian can be at a place where they revert back to the practice of some sins in their life. But what happens to a Christian when they find that they're practicing sin? They hate that sin. They hate themselves and they turn back to God and they confess their sin. But then there are others who have not ever really turned from the practice of sin. They've never really turned from the love of sin in their heart, and they've never really been a person like Joseph who says, there's temptation in there, I'm going to avoid it, because they hate sin. Not just some sins, not just particular sins, but sin in general, what offends God. That's why we need to be saved. That's why we need the power of God, the love of God, we need the salvation of God. If you don't hate sin, then you need to confess before God that as a sinner, you loved the wrong thing. You loved that instead of Jesus. You need to give your heart to Christ. And you need to say, Lord, from now on I want to hate sin. And I want to be like Joseph. And I want to run from temptation. And if you're a young person, you need to make the commitment that I will not put myself in a situation like a dating scene where I'm alone with somebody and I'm going to run headlong into temptation. No way. I'm not going to do that because God forbids it, and I won't do it. Protect your purity, protect your testimony, and protect the glory of God. Let's pray.